Okay, so in this section, we're looking at how the UDHR appeared, what the drafting process was, and who the bodies were that were involved in deciding on this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, at the end of World War II, there was a lot of discussion around the world that there needed to be some kind of new international order. New organizations were formed, of course, the United Nations, but also the World Bank and the IMF and other organizations like that. Also, this new kind of set of values in terms of how states should be managed and limiting the powers of states. So before World War II, state sovereign power was almost infinite. States could do what they want. But after this, they thought there needed to be more power of an international organization like the United Nations, and more also authority of kind of standards like the UDHR to define what states can and cannot do. And so when the UN was formed in 1945, it had a management, it was going to manage a number of different areas, say development and international law. But one of the areas that it had to kind of develop was this idea of what was then called fundamental and human rights. So how that happened was in the UN Charter, and the Charter itself is kind of like the constitution that founds the United Nations. The UN Charter says one of the purposes of the United Nations is promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without any distinctions as to race, sex, language, or religion. So we can see that the human rights is one of the purposes. And as I just mentioned before, there were kind of 4 or 5 other purposes, such as, peace, friendly relations between nations, international law, development, and so on. Now, but how this purpose of the of human rights came about was that was given to one of the organs that we call ECOSOC, which is actually the Economic and Social Council, and they had to formulate a Bill of Rights. And this was done by firstly forming a committee, or actually was called a commission, the Human Rights Commission, which was formed in 1946. And this 9-member commission was headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, had the task of then drafting this Universal Declaration. So Eleanor Roosevelt was an American, and she was the husband of FDR Roosevelt, who was the president at the time. Well, actually at this time, FDR Roosevelt had died. So he died in, I think, late 1945. But Eleanor Roosevelt was quite famous for her kind of work around women's rights and international rights, and was quite a strong political figure. So she led the this commission of 9 people. Now, while we've got here the 9 people, though there was this 9 people who were kind of charged with drafting the UDHR, a lot of other people were involved as well. And they did get information from around the world, from a range of people, whether it was from philosophers or diplomats or international organizations and so on. As we can see from the makeup of this body, that there is a bit of a mix. So we have a few Europeans, there's France, people from France there, and Canada and Australia. There's also Charles Malik from Lebanon, PC Chung, Pen Chongchang from China. At this time, China was what we now know as Taiwan. So it was the Kuomintang China, but also from Eastern Europe as well. So Alexander Bogomolov was involved. And then someone from Chile, but also there were kind of some famous figures from the Philippines and Egypt and India who kind of gave information. They might have not been actually like a committee member. They were involved in the drafting process. And so it was a fairly global process in terms of how they were drafting the UDHR. And this is a picture of the nine people. Of course, it wasn't universal in terms of gender. There was just Eleanor Roosevelt involved in it. And we can see that in the language of the UDHR. It is, very gendered in terms of the language. Okay, but these figures are quite famous. Now, how the actual drafting occurred is that Humphrey, who's in the bottom right, and then Pierre Cassin, who's in the middle to the left of the screen, they kind of gathered rights from all the constitutions around the world, and they got further kind of recommendations from rights from other experts. And they just formed this big list of all the existing rights in the world, and then gradually kind of combined that and edited that till, in the end, 2 or 3 years later, we come up with like the 26 or 27 or so rights in the UDHR. So it's primarily how it was formed. Now, René Cassin is kind of known as the father of the UDHR, but it wasn't really him alone. You know, Humphreys from Canada was quite influential, Eleanor Roosevelt as well. And even things like economic, social, and cultural rights, like these were really pushed by Romulo from the Philippines and also Cruz from Chile. So the idea of economic, social, and cultural rights was kind of like an Asian and an African thing at this time. Now, after sort of 2 years of debating and formulating the Universal Declaration, a couple of things happened. Like, firstly, they decided we're going to make this a declaration and not a convention. Because they said if it's going to be a convention, it's going to be long and lots of arguments. Let's just make a declaration, which means it's adopted by the General Assembly, but it has no legally binding power. Now, we'll return to that question about the legally binding power of the